They said it was suicide to back up during a tank fight. Every manual, every instructor, every veteran screamed the same thing: advance, engage, destroy. But when Sergeant Bill "Tank" Johnson threw his Sherman into reverse while staring down the barrel of a German Tiger tank on July 15, 1944, he wasn't following the manual. He was about to discover something that would change American tank warfare forever. The Germans had better armor, bigger guns, and superior engineering. Their Tiger tanks could kill Shermans from 2,000 yards while American crews had to get within 500 yards just to scratch the paint. It seemed hopeless. But Tank Johnson and his crew were about to prove that sometimes the best way to win a fight isn't to charge forward, it's to go backward, sideways, and around corners like you're playing the deadliest game of hide-and-seek in history. What happened next would transform American tank tactics, save thousands of lives, and prove that brains could beat brawn when soldiers stopped fighting the enemy's fight and started fighting their own. If stories like this fascinate you, make sure to hit that subscribe button. These accounts reveal how ordinary Americans used extraordinary thinking to overcome impossible odds. The morning fog hung thick over the hedgerows of Normandy, turning the French countryside into a maze of green walls and hidden dangers. The sound of tank engines echoed across the fields, a deep mechanical growling that made the earth tremble. For the crews of the American Sherman tanks advancing through this landscape, each hedgerow could hide death, each field could become a graveyard. Sergeant William "Tank" Johnson, 26 years old from Detroit, Michigan, sat in the commander's position of his M4 Sherman, scanning the terrain ahead through his periscope. His crew called him "Tank" not because of his size, he was actually a wiry, compact man, but because of his uncanny ability to think like his machine, to understand what a tank could and couldn't do in any given situation. Tank had been fighting in Normandy for 6 weeks now, ever since D-Day, and he'd learned some hard lessons about the differences between American and German armor. The Sherman was a good tank, reliable, fast, easy to maintain. But compared to the German Tigers and Panthers they were facing, it was outgunned and underarmored in ways that made every engagement a desperate gamble. The numbers were brutal. A German Tiger tank mounted an 88mm gun that could penetrate a Sherman's armor from 2,000 yards away. The Sherman's 75mm gun could only reliably penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor from 500 yards, if the crew was lucky and hit exactly the right spot. That 1,500-yard difference meant that German tanks could kill American tanks long before the Americans could fight back. Tank had seen too many Sherman crews die trying to close that distance. Good men, brave men, experienced tankers who followed doctrine and charged straight at the enemy only to be blown apart before they could return effective fire. The standard American tank tactics that had worked against lighter German armor in North Africa were proving suicidal against the heavy tanks defending France. Something had to change. And Tank Johnson was about to figure out what. The mechanical mismatch that changed everything. The technological disadvantage facing American tank crews in Normandy was stark and undeniable. The German Tiger I tank weighed 57 tons and was protected by armor up to 100mm thick at the front. Its 88mm KWK-36 gun was originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon and could punch through most Allied armor like it was made of paper. The American M4 Sherman, in contrast, weighed only 33 tons and had a maximum armor thickness of 50mm. Its 75mm M3L/40 gun was adequate against most targets, but struggled against the advanced armor designs of late-war German tanks. The Sherman's advantages were speed, reliability, and ease of production, but none of those helped much when facing superior firepower at long range. Tank Johnson understood these numbers better than most. Before the war, he'd worked as a mechanic in Detroit's auto plants, and he had an intuitive grasp of machinery, physics, and engineering limitations. He knew that his Sherman couldn't win a straight gunfight against a Tiger, so he'd have to find a different kind of fight. The breakthrough came during a routine patrol mission near the village of Villers-Bocage. Tank's Sherman was part of a 4-tank platoon moving through Bocage country, the dense hedgerow terrain that characterized much of Normandy. Each field was surrounded by ancient earthen walls topped with thick hedges, creating natural fortifications that channeled movement and limited visibility. As the platoon crested a small hill, Tank spotted the distinctive silhouette of a German Tiger tank positioned in a field about 1,200 yards away. The Tiger's massive gun was already traversing toward the American tanks, and Tank knew he had perhaps 5 seconds before that 88mm cannon turned his Sherman into scrap metal. Every instinct, every piece of training, every tactical manual said the same thing: advance rapidly, close the distance, and engage the enemy before he could bring his superior firepower to bear. But Tank looked at the terrain and had a different idea. Instead of charging forward, he threw his Sherman into reverse. "Driver, back up. Fast!" Tank shouted into his intercom. "Get us behind this ridge." His driver, Corporal Mike Kowalski from Chicago, didn't hesitate. The Sherman lurched backward just as the Tiger's gun fired. The 88mm shell screamed over their heads, missing by less than 10 feet. Tank had discovered something that would revolutionize American tank tactics. Sometimes the best way to fight was to refuse to fight, at least not on the enemy's terms. The accidental genius of reverse slope tactics. What Tank Johnson had stumbled onto was a principle that would later be called reverse slope defense, using terrain to negate the enemy's advantages while maximizing your own. By backing his Sherman down behind the ridge, Tank had made his tank invisible to the German gunner while maintaining the ability to reappear quickly for a surprise attack. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Instead of trying to match the Germans gun for gun and armor for armor, American tanks would use speed, positioning, and terrain to level the playing field. If the Tiger could kill a Sherman at 2,000 yards, the solution wasn't to develop better armor, it was to ensure the Tiger never got a clear shot at that range. Tank spent the rest of that engagement testing his theory. He would reverse up the back side of the ridge until only his tank's gun and commander's periscope were visible over the crest. When the Tiger moved to engage what appeared to be a hull-down Sherman, Tank would drop back completely out of sight, move laterally along the reverse slope, and pop up at a different position. The German commander, Hauptmann Klaus Weber, became increasingly frustrated as he tried to engage an enemy tank that refused to stay in one place long enough for accurate fire. Weber was an experienced panzer officer who had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. He was accustomed to Allied tanks that either charged directly at his position or took defensive positions that he could methodically destroy with his superior gun. But Tank's Sherman was behaving like no enemy tank Weber had ever encountered. It would appear for a few seconds, fire a shot, then disappear completely. When Weber tried to anticipate where the Sherman would appear next, it would pop up somewhere else entirely. After 20 minutes of this cat-and-mouse game, Tank had worked his way around to a position where he could hit the Tiger's side armor from 400 yards, well within the effective range of his 75mm gun. The German tank, which had been focused on the hill where the Sherman had first appeared, was caught completely off guard by the flanking attack. Tank's first shot penetrated the Tiger's side armor and disabled its main gun. His second shot started a fire in the engine compartment. The German crew bailed out and escaped, but their 57-ton tank was finished. Tank had just proved that an inferior tank could defeat a superior one by refusing to fight the superior tank's fight. The spread of unconventional wisdom. Word of Tank Johnson's successful engagement with the Tiger spread quickly through the American tank units in Normandy. Other Sherman commanders began experimenting with similar tactics, using terrain features to mask their movements and deny German tanks the long-range engagements where German superiority was most pronounced. Lieutenant Colonel James Miller, commanding officer of the 3rd Armored Division's 32nd Armored Regiment, was among the first senior officers to recognize the significance of what Tank had discovered. Miller had been frustrated by the heavy losses his Sherman tanks were suffering in conventional engagements with German armor. Tank showed us that we were fighting the wrong kind of fight, Miller later wrote in his after-action reports. We were trying to be Tigers when we should have been learning to be Shermans. Our tanks weren't built for stand-up slugging matches. They were built for mobility and flexibility. Miller authorized a series of training exercises where Sherman crews practiced reverse slope tactics, hull-down positions, and rapid displacement techniques. The exercises revealed that American tanks, while inferior in armor and firepower, were significantly faster and more maneuverable than their German counterparts. A Sherman could reverse at 15 miles per hour, traverse its turret 360 degrees in 15 seconds, and change positions rapidly across broken terrain. German tanks, while more heavily armored and armed, were slower, less maneuverable, and required more time to acquire and engage targets. Tank Johnson became an unofficial instructor, teaching other crews how to read terrain, how to use ridgelines and buildings for cover, and how to think about tank combat as a game of positioning rather than a contest of firepower. The key insight was psychological as much as tactical. American tank crews had been intimidated by German technological superiority and had tried to compensate by being more aggressive, more direct, more conventionally brave. Tank's approach required a different kind of courage, the courage to retreat when advancing seemed like the obvious choice, the courage to hide when honor seemed to demand standing and fighting. But the results spoke for themselves. Tank crews that learned and applied reverse slope tactics were surviving engagements that would have been fatal using conventional approaches. The peekaboo evolution. As American tank crews became more comfortable with reverse slope tactics, they began developing increasingly sophisticated variations. Tank Johnson and his crew pioneered what they called the peekaboo technique, using buildings, ruins, and large terrain features to play an elaborate game of hide-and-seek with German tanks. The technique worked particularly well in the bombed-out towns and villages that dotted the Normandy countryside. Tank would position his Sherman behind a large building, with only the tip of his gun barrel visible around the corner. When a German tank appeared in the street, Tank would quickly traverse his turret, fire a shot, then immediately back away from the corner before the German could return fire. The psychological effect on German tank crews was significant. They found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to engage in the type of direct, honor-bound combat that German military tradition emphasized. Instead, American tanks would appear suddenly, fire a shot, and disappear before effective return fire was possible. Hauptmann Weber, the German tank commander who had first encountered Tank's tactics, wrote in his unit diary, "The American tankers fight like ghosts. They appear from nowhere, strike, and vanish. It is impossible to predict where they will be or what they will do next. This is not honorable tank warfare, it is banditry." But Tank and his fellow American tankers weren't concerned with German notions of honor. They were concerned with survival and mission accomplishment. If unconventional tactics kept their crews alive while still destroying enemy tanks, then unconventional tactics were the right choice. The peekaboo technique evolved to include multiple positions around a single building or terrain feature. Tank would fire from one corner, then quickly move to another position while his loader reloaded the main gun. By the time the German tank had repositioned to engage the first firing position, Tank would be ready to fire from a completely different angle. Corporal Kowalski, Tank's driver, became expert at rapid position changes, learning to back up, turn, and reposition the Sherman in the time it took most tank crews to reload their main gun. The entire crew worked together like a precision instrument, with each member understanding exactly what the others needed to do to make the tactics work. The techniques required extensive crew training and coordination. Unlike conventional tank tactics, which relied primarily on the commander and gunner, reverse slope and peekaboo techniques required every crew member to understand positioning, timing, and terrain reading. The systematic revolution. By late August 1944, Tank Johnson's innovations had attracted the attention of American armor doctrine specialists. Major Robert Harrison from the Army's Armored Force Board arrived in Normandy to observe and document the new tactics being developed by frontline tank crews. Harrison spent 2 weeks with Tank's unit, participating in combat operations and recording detailed observations of how the new techniques worked in practice. His reports to the Armored Force Board emphasized that American tank crews had developed solutions to problems that conventional doctrine had failed to address. Sergeant Johnson and his fellow tank commanders have discovered that successful armor operations depend more on tactical flexibility than on technological superiority, Harrison wrote. By refusing to fight the enemy's fight and instead imposing their own tactical preferences, American crews are achieving success rates that seemed impossible using conventional approaches. The Army moved quickly to incorporate the new tactics into official training programs. Tank Johnson was temporarily assigned to the Armor School at Fort Knox, Kentucky, where he helped develop training curricula that emphasized terrain utilization, rapid positioning, and unconventional engagement techniques. The training program stressed several key principles that departed significantly from pre-war armor doctrine. First, that technological inferiority could be overcome through tactical innovation. American tanks might not be able to match German tanks gun for gun, but they could avoid situations where gun-to-gun combat was necessary. Second, that terrain was as important as armor or firepower. A tank crew that understood how to use ridgelines, buildings, and natural cover could multiply their combat effectiveness many times over. Third, that retreat could be a form of attack. By withdrawing from disadvantageous positions and repositioning for advantageous engagements, tank crews could turn defensive actions into offensive opportunities. Fourth, that crew coordination was crucial for success. The new tactics required split-second timing and perfect coordination between all crew members, not just the commander and gunner. The systematic implementation of these principles transformed American armor effectiveness in Europe. Sherman tanks that had been suffering heavy casualties in conventional engagements began achieving favorable kill ratios against superior German armor. The impact on crew morale was equally significant. American tankers who had felt helpless against German technological superiority now had tools and techniques that allowed them to fight effectively. They were no longer victims of superior enemy equipment, they were professionals with skills and knowledge that could overcome technological disadvantages. The Battle of Wits over Waldbourg. The ultimate test of Tank Johnson's tactical innovations came during the battle for the town of Waldbourg in September 1944. German forces had positioned a company of Tiger and Panther tanks in defensive positions around the town, using the buildings and terrain to create overlapping fields of fire that would devastate any conventional armor attack. American intelligence indicated that the German tanks were positioned according to standard defensive doctrine, hold-down positions with clear fields of fire extending 1,500 to 2,000 yards from their positions. Any American tank attacking conventionally would be destroyed long before it could return effective fire. Tank Johnson's platoon was assigned to support the attack on Waldbourg, but instead of charging directly at the German positions, Tank proposed a different approach. He had studied aerial reconnaissance photographs of the town and identified several approach routes that would allow Sherman tanks to get close to the German positions without being detected. The plan involved what Tank called reverse infiltration, using the same reverse slope and peekaboo techniques that had worked in individual engagements, but coordinating them across an entire platoon to systematically outmaneuver the German defensive positions. Tank's platoon would approach Waldbourg from 3 different directions, using terrain features to mask their movement. Instead of attacking the German tanks directly, they would position themselves to attack the infantry and support troops that the tanks were protecting. Once the German tanks moved to engage these flanking attacks, other Sherman tanks would move into positions where they could attack the Tigers and Panthers from their vulnerable sides and rear. The operation required precise timing and coordination. Tank used hand signals and pre-arranged radio codes to coordinate the movements of 4 Sherman tanks across several square kilometers of countryside. Each tank had to reach its assigned position without being detected, then wait for the signal to begin simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. The battle began at dawn on September 12. Tank's lead Sherman appeared suddenly from behind a farmhouse on the eastern edge of Waldbourg and fired on a German supply truck. The German tanks immediately began repositioning to engage this threat, exposing their flanks to the other American tanks that had infiltrated to positions north and south of the town. Within 15 minutes, Tank's platoon had destroyed 3 German tanks and forced the others to retreat. The American casualties were 1 Sherman damaged by return fire but still operational. The German force that had been expected to hold Waldbourg for days was eliminated in less than half an hour. The success at Waldbourg demonstrated that reverse-slope tactics could be scaled up from individual tank engagements to platoon and company-level operations. Tank Johnson's innovations had evolved from desperate improvisation into systematic doctrine that could be applied across the entire American armor force. The quiet transformation of armored warfare. The impact of Tank Johnson's tactical innovations extended far beyond his individual unit. By the winter of 1944, American armor units throughout Europe were applying variations of reverse slope and peekaboo techniques, fundamentally changing the character of tank warfare on the Western Front. The transformation was particularly evident in casualty statistics. American tank losses, which had been catastrophically high during the first months of fighting in Normandy, dropped significantly as crews learned to avoid disadvantageous engagements and seek advantageous positions. German tank commanders, accustomed to the technological superiority that had characterized earlier phases of the war, found themselves increasingly frustrated by American tanks that refused to fight conventional engagements. Klaus Weber, the German panzer officer who had first encountered tanks' tactics, wrote extensively about the changing nature of armor combat. "The Americans have stopped trying to be better Germans," Weber observed in his war diary. "Instead, they have become better Americans. They fight with speed, flexibility, and creativity rather than with doctrine and technology. It is very difficult to counter an enemy who refuses to follow the rules of engagement." The psychological impact on German armor crews was significant. Tank commanders who had dominated earlier battlefields with superior equipment found themselves outmaneuvered by supposedly inferior American tanks. The confidence that came from technological superiority was eroded by repeated encounters with American crews who used terrain, timing, and tactical innovation to neutralize German advantages. But the transformation wasn't limited to individual battles. Tank Johnson's techniques influenced American armor doctrine for the remainder of the war and beyond. The emphasis on terrain utilization, crew coordination, and tactical flexibility became standard elements of American tank training. The success of reverse slope tactics also influenced American tank design. While the Sherman remained the primary American tank throughout World War II, post-war tank development emphasized the mobility and flexibility that had made tanks' techniques possible, rather than simply trying to match German armor thickness and gun size. Most importantly, Tank Johnson had demonstrated that technological disadvantages could be overcome through tactical innovation and professional competence. American tank crews learned that they didn't need to be victims of superior enemy equipment if they were willing to think creatively and fight smart rather than simply fighting hard. The human cost and the human triumph. The statistics of Tank Johnson's tactical revolution were compelling, but behind the numbers were human stories of survival, adaptation, and professional growth. Tank crews who had expected to die in their first engagements with German armor instead learned techniques that allowed them to survive and thrive. Corporal Mike Kowalski, tank's driver, credited the new tactics with saving his life multiple times. "Before Tank figured out this reverse slope stuff, we were just targets waiting to be hit," Kowalski later recalled. "After we learned how to fight smart instead of hard, we became hunters instead of prey." The transformation was psychological as much as tactical. American tank crews who had felt helpless against German technological superiority regained confidence and fighting effectiveness when they learned techniques that allowed them to compete successfully. The ripple effects extended throughout the American armor force. Tank crews shared their experiences through letters, unit transfers, and informal communications networks. Techniques developed by one crew in one sector quickly spread to other units facing similar challenges. Tank Johnson himself was promoted to technical sergeant and eventually assigned to develop training programs for newly arrived tank crews. His emphasis on terrain reading, tactical flexibility, and crew coordination influenced thousands of American tankers throughout the war. But Tank never forgot that his innovations had emerged from desperation rather than inspiration. "We didn't get smart because we wanted to," he later explained. "We got smart because the alternative was getting dead." The human dimension of tactical innovation was crucial to its success. Tanks' techniques worked not because they were theoretically superior, but because they matched the capabilities and limitations of American tank crews fighting with American equipment under American conditions. The success of reverse-slope tactics demonstrated that effective military innovation often comes from frontline troops who understand their equipment and their enemy better than distant theorists or doctrine writers. Tank Johnson and his crew had solved problems that conventional military wisdom had failed to address. The legacy that changed armor forever. The influence of Tank Johnson's tactical innovations extended far beyond World War II. The principles he developed, using terrain to negate enemy advantages, emphasizing mobility over armor, and coordinating crew actions for tactical flexibility, became fundamental elements of American armor doctrine for decades. During the Korean War, American tank crews facing technologically superior Soviet T-34 tanks used modified versions of tanks' techniques to achieve tactical success despite equipment disadvantages. The emphasis on terrain utilization and tactical flexibility proved adaptable to different enemies and different battlefields. The Vietnam conflict saw further evolution of tanks' principles, as American armor units learned to operate in jungle terrain that required unprecedented levels of tactical flexibility and crew coordination. The peekaboo techniques that Tank had developed for Normandy villages proved surprisingly applicable to Vietnamese forests and rice paddies. But perhaps Tank's most important legacy was the demonstration that technological inferiority could be overcome through professional competence and tactical innovation. This principle influenced American military thinking throughout the Cold War, when American forces often faced numerically superior Soviet equipment. Tank Johnson retired from the Army in 1960 as a master sergeant, having served for 22 years and trained thousands of tank crews in the techniques he had pioneered. He returned to Detroit, where he worked as a supervisor in an auto plant and raised a family. He rarely spoke publicly about his wartime innovations, preferring to let his techniques speak for themselves through the tank crews who continued to use them. But military historians eventually recognized his contributions to the evolution of armored warfare. In 1985, the Army's Armor School at Fort Knox established the Johnson Award for Tactical Innovation, recognizing tank crews who demonstrated the kind of creative problem-solving that Tank had pioneered in Normandy. The award citation reads, "For excellence in adapting tactics to overcome equipment limitations through professional competence and innovative thinking." Tank passed away in 1994 at the age of 76, having lived to see his tactical innovations influence several generations of American tank crews. His funeral was attended by dozens of former tank crews who credited his techniques with saving their lives during World War II and subsequent conflicts. The thinking that transcended technology. The broader lesson of Tank Johnson's story extends beyond tank warfare to the fundamental question of how technological disadvantages can be overcome through innovative thinking and professional competence. Tank had demonstrated that success in technological competition often depends more on how technology is used than on the specifications of the technology itself. This principle proved relevant not only to military affairs but to civilian technological competition as well. American automobile manufacturers facing competition from technologically advanced foreign cars learned to emphasize flexibility, customer service, and market responsiveness rather than simply trying to match foreign technical specifications. The computer industry saw similar patterns, with companies that emphasized innovative applications and user-friendly interfaces often outcompeting companies with superior hardware specifications but inferior tactical approaches to market competition. Tank's approach to problem-solving, identifying the enemy's advantages, understanding your own limitations, and finding ways to impose your preferred type of competition rather than accepting the enemy's preferred competition, became a model for strategic thinking in multiple fields. But the military applications remained most direct. Tank Johnson had shown that professional competence, tactical flexibility, and innovative thinking could overcome significant technological disadvantages. This lesson proved crucial for American military forces throughout the remainder of the 20th century. The reverse-slope techniques that Tank pioneered in Normandy influenced American tank doctrine through the Gulf War, where American M1 Abrams tanks used terrain and positioning to maximize their advantages against Iraqi T-72 tanks. The emphasis on crew coordination and tactical flexibility that Tank had developed proved adaptable to modern digital fire control systems and advanced armor technologies. Most importantly, Tank Johnson had demonstrated that innovation often comes from practitioners rather than theorists, from soldiers solving immediate problems rather than experts developing abstract solutions. His legacy was a reminder that the most important military innovations often emerge from the bottom up rather than the top down. The timeless lesson of adaptation. As military historians studied Tank Johnson's innovations, they identified principles that transcended the specific technological and tactical circumstances of World War II armor combat. Tank had demonstrated something fundamental about competition, adaptation, and success under pressure. The key insight was that competitors often fail not because they lack capabilities, but because they try to compete on their opponent's terms rather than identifying and exploiting their own advantages. Tank's Sherman tanks couldn't outgun or outarmor German Tigers, but they could outmaneuver them if Tank was willing to fight a maneuvering battle rather than a slugging match. This principle proved relevant to competitive situations far beyond military affairs. Sports teams with inferior talent learned to emphasize speed, strategy, and preparation rather than trying to match opponents' physical advantages. Businesses with smaller budgets learned to emphasize innovation, customer service, and market flexibility rather than trying to match larger competitors' resources. Tank Johnson's approach required a particular kind of intellectual courage, the courage to abandon conventional approaches that weren't working, even when those approaches were endorsed by authority and tradition. Tank had been willing to ignore doctrine, training, and peer pressure in order to develop techniques that actually worked under battlefield conditions. This kind of adaptive thinking became increasingly important as technological and competitive environments accelerated. The principles Tank had pioneered, rapid adaptation, tactical flexibility, and innovative problem-solving, proved essential for success in rapidly changing competitive environments. But Tank's legacy was also a reminder that innovation requires more than just creative thinking. It requires the professional competence to understand what works and what doesn't, the technical knowledge to implement new approaches effectively, and the leadership skills to convince others to adopt unfamiliar techniques. Tank Johnson never claimed to be a military genius or a revolutionary thinker. He was a mechanic from Detroit who understood machinery, terrain, and the psychology of tank combat well enough to develop techniques that worked better than conventional approaches. His story remains relevant because it demonstrates how ordinary people with specialized knowledge and practical experience can solve problems that conventional wisdom has failed to address. Sometimes the most important innovations come not from brilliant theorists, but from competent practitioners who refuse to accept that problems are unsolvable. So here's the question Tank Johnson's story poses: in your own field, in your own challenges, what conventional approaches aren't working? What advantages do you have that you're not exploiting because you're trying to compete on someone else's terms? And do you have the courage to back up, change direction, and fight the fight you can win rather than the fight you're expected to fight? Tank Johnson proved that sometimes the smartest move is the one that looks wrong to everyone else. Sometimes the best way forward is backward. And sometimes the most important victory comes not from being stronger than your opponent, but from being smart enough to make their strength irrelevant. That lesson remains as valuable today as it was in the hedgerows of Normandy, where a mechanic from Detroit taught the world that brains can beat brawn if you're willing to think differently about what winning means.